Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Chronic Fatigue and Burnout Recovery podcast. Today is a very special episode because I have had the honor and the privilege to interview Dr. Sarah Myhill on the podcast and discuss her latest book, which is Diagnosis and Treatment of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, Myalgic Encephalitis, and Long COVID, with the strapline, "It's mitochondria, not hypochondria." Now, Dr. Sarah Myhill is probably a bit of an icon in the chronic fatigue space. She has been practicing medicine since before I was born. And I believe in her book, she says she's worked with over 8,000 chronic fatigue patients across her career, and very successfully so. Something else which I really love is she shares that she is one of the most investigated doctors by the GMC, which is the General Medical Council, because everybody is so curious about why she's doing what she's doing and what she's doing is working, and her clients, her patients are actually getting better versus many other chronic fatigue and chronic illness patients who are stuck in the traditional medical system and not getting better. So this is such a fantastic interview, just kind of touching briefly on some points from her book, which I would highly recommend you get. It's a great little handbook as you navigate your chronic fatigue experience. But it was such a pleasure to interview Dr. Myhill because she really does practice what she preaches, and it just absolutely oozes from her. You can sense her energy, her passion, and her drive. And it was just a fantastic interview for me personally, but I'm sure it will also be fantastic for you as the listener to listen to. So dive in and enjoy. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Chronic Fatigue and Burnout Recovery podcast. Today is a very special day because I have the honor and the pleasure and the privilege of interviewing Dr. Sarah Myhill today. Dr. Myhill has recently published a new book called The Diagnosis and Treatment of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, Myalgic Encephalitis, and Long COVID. And she's here today to talk a little bit more about the book. But before I say too much, welcome, Sarah. Such a pleasure to have you here. And how are you today?
Very kind, Jana. I'm top whole form. Thank you very much. I do actually practice what I preach. So everything that I'm going to be suggesting that you and your listeners do, I also do, because all these things keep us on tip-top form so we can live life to its full potential.
Absolutely. And I think that's a strong sense of what I got from reading the book, is that it was very, very clear from reading the book that you are practicing what you preach and leading by example. And one of the things you said in the book, which I really loved, was as we age, we all get a chronic fatigue syndrome of sorts. And that actually just feels like a really nice place to start, given what you've just said. So I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit more for the people who are thinking, no, I have this chronic fatigue syndrome. How could my healthy partner or, whoever also have some sort of chronic fatigue syndrome?
Well, it's absolutely true. And guess what? Now, I mean, chronic fatigue syndrome is not a diagnosis, it's a clinical picture. And we all know that as we age, our energy levels decline. And I see the whole of life from an energy perspective. When we're young, in our teenagers, in our 20s, we have endless energy. We don't factor that into any plans, do we? We just assume the energies are going to be there to do things. But as we age, we know that to a certain extent, we have to pace our activities. In fact, some people say to me, when I say to them, well, how do you feel? They look into the distance. They say, well, you see that 90-year-old woman crossing the road, at 3 months. I feel like her. I feel I just have to crawl along. I have to pace my energy very carefully. I've got only so much stamina to last me for the day. That's how I feel. And, I see the whole of life from an energy perspective like that. And we know that energy is absolutely critical in the prevention of heart disease, cancer, dementia, degenerative diseases, and so on. So whilst the regimes I'm asking people to do are difficult, what I can say is, and by getting those in place, not only will you start to heal your chronic fatigue and your ME, but you will also prevent yourself from dying young. Your best years are ahead of you. So, my view is we should all live to our full potential as long as we can, and then, very quickly, fall off the perch when the moment arises. And there's an old boy I look after who's in my granny flat, and he's stayed here for 7 years, and I obviously feed him and do it all. And in July, we will celebrate his 102nd birthday.
Wow.
And not only is he very well from a pathology point of view, but his brain is as sharp as a tack. There's no hint of dementia. He remembers things beautifully. He tells stories. He's a very good raconteur. So the point is, it is all possible, and we must all do it.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we share very similar viewpoints in terms of life. And probably that's also from my own experience with poor energy. But you describe this idea of it, you keep on referring to these regimes. And I think in the book you talk about it's like building a house, and you have to have a strong house, you need a strong foundation. And I think most people would probably be on board with that. And what are the most important foundations that you believe people need to put in place?
It's diet, and diet. It's all about food and what we eat. And the analogy another analogy I love to use is energy delivery mechanisms is a little bit like having a good car. And to have a good car to work, you've got to have the right fuel in the tank, and that's all about diet and gut function. You've got to have oxygen getting in there, and many people don't breathe correctly. Then you have to have what I call the mitochondrial engine, and that's where my special area of interest. We publish papers showing that people with fatigue syndrome have very poor engine function. Their mitochondria don't work well. Then we have to have the thyroid accelerator pedal, and the underactive thyroid is common. And then, of course, the adrenal gearbox. And with all those things in place, then your car's going to go. And I want my car to be going along at 50, 60 miles an hour to get me through life. I don't want to be crawling along at 15 miles an hour. That's awfully boring, isn't it? So that's all about energy delivery mechanisms. And then we talk about ME. We talk about long COVID in the book and other forms of ME. Now, ME, again, it's not a diagnosis. It's a clinical picture. We have to ask the question, why? And people who have ME, yes, they have poor energy delivery mechanisms, as we just discussed, but they also have, as I call it, an immunological hole in their energy bucket. Their immune system is busy. And when the immune system is busy, it produces inflammation. And inflammation, yes, it's very good news if you're fighting infection, an acute infection. But if you've got allergy, autoimmunity, or chronic infection, it can actually make things much worse. It's inappropriate inflammation. And inflammation causes pain, redness, heat, swelling, loss of function. It's real bad news. So the key point to remember is that chronic fatigue syndrome and ME are not diagnoses, they are clinical pictures. And we have to ask the question, why? Because that constitutes a proper diagnosis. Once you've got a proper diagnosis, then you know what to do about it.
And so just for the listener who's thinking like, whoa, this is a lot of information. My brain is already tired. Like, how am I going to process it all? Is what you're saying that that distinguishing point between the inflammation is really important to understand, because if somebody's got the CFS-ME, which means they've got the inflammatory component, we need to really consider the immune system as part of the treatment approach.
Absolutely. Now, I mean, that roadmap that I paint out for you, okay, it sounds very logical, but the point is what impacts on both inflammation and energy delivery mechanisms is the diet. And if I have somebody who's foggy brains and they can't get all these ideas in their head, I just say, take a leap of faith. You just must start with the diet and the basic package of nutritional supplements and sorting out the gut. And then that will immediately give you more energy, and therefore your brain can process all this new stuff. But as I say, it tackles both sides of the equation, the fatigue and the inflammatory component, because so much of that inflammation is allergy. And the two big allergens are grains, and gluten grains and dairy products. And that is, again, the starting point of the paleo ketogenic diet. No gluten grains, no dairy products, low carbohydrate. And then so that is, so much then falls into place once you've got that on board.
You're sort of preaching to the choir here, talking to me. In my own journey, I did a paleo ketogenic diet and a lot of intermittent fasting as well. And it was really helpful. The diet can be such a tricky thing for people because of all the emotional attachments we have to food.
Correct.
So I'm curious if there's any advice you give your clients who are maybe like a bit more resistant to the changes.
Okay. Well, another very useful way to give you a pointer that you're on your way to fatigue or on your way to trouble is the use of addictions. Because we use addictions to deal with stress. And I think stress is one of the symptoms the brain gives us when it knows it doesn't have the energy to deal with demands. We have a cup of coffee or a sweet biscuit or a bag of crisps, and they just give us a little hit of energy because in the short term, sugar and refined carbohydrates are rocket fuel. But in the medium term, they're very, very damaging to our biochemistry. So the use of addictions like cigarettes, alcohol, caffeine, amphetamines, speed, all these are clues that we are beginning to run out of energy and we're using these to keep up. If you really ask yourself, am I living an addictive life? I'm going from one cup of coffee to the next sandwich, to the next bag of crisps, to the next bit of chocolate, to the fag or whatever, or to what glass of wine you need, then that's usually the beginning of the rot. And, I have every sympathy. I mean, life is stressful now. Period. End of story. Whatever we do, whether it's financially stressful or physically stressful or mentally or emotionally, whatever, life is full of stress. And stress is uncomfortable. And so we use addictions to deal with that. So I have every sympathy for, but the starting point to get well is we have to give up all our addictions. And I know that sounds very challenging in the short term, but very often the prospect of giving up addictions is often worse than the actual doing of it. People don't think of sugars and carbohydrates as addiction, and so somehow that's okay. And what they often do is instead of giving up all their addictions, they replace one addiction with another. So what do we know about the smoker? What does the smoker do who gives up smoking? They go and have sweets instead. They go for sugars and carbohydrates. And okay, that helps satisfy their addictive cravings. But guess what? They put on weight and they get fat. And so many people tell me, as soon as I gave up smoking, I got fat. Why? Because they replace one addiction with another. And we also know that one addiction tends to switch on another addiction. So people go to the pub and they'll have a drink, and then they want a bag of crisps, and then they want a fag, and then they have to go away and have something extra to eat because their blood sugar's low. So to deal with addiction, we have to give them all up. And the worst and most pernicious are sugars, carbohydrates, and processed foods because they're quick, convenient, easy, socially acceptable, and everybody does it.
Exactly. And what would you say to the person as well? Can't I just have some fruit? Or can't I surely my whole grain brown rice is okay? How would you respond to something like that?
Well, it's like saying to, the cocaine addict, you can have a little bit of cocaine. It's okay, ducky. But we know that's not the case. It's like the cigarette smoker. They've got to give them, it's very rare you have somebody who will just have one cigarette a day. If they have one cigarette a day, I wouldn't whine about that. I'd say, that's absolutely fine. But 20 isn't, 10 isn't. And it's the same with food, And believe it or not, I'm as good an addict as any. Both my parents died from alcohol-related diseases. I know I could happily become alcoholic or whatever. And my addiction is switched on by a taste of. So if you gave me a square of Galaxy chocolate, I wouldn't be happy until the whole bar had gone. And many others I know identify with that. And so I just have to say no to the first one because I know what a horrible addict I am. It's the same with brown rice, a little mouth of rice and I want the whole, a little bit of bread and I want the whole loaf. So whatever switches on that sort of craving, then it's an addiction. Interestingly, I had a lovely guy who came to see me, and he said how he had gone to casualty once and he had very severe gout and his very severe joint pain, and his blood tests were all fine. And they couldn't work out what was going on. And one of the doctors said to him, "Is there something you really like?" And he said, "Yes, I love tomatoes. Can't go without tomatoes." Oh, she said, "Stop that." And guess what? He stopped all his tomatoes and his pain completely disappeared. Wow. So allergy and addiction are two sides of the same coin. And he now knows he's allergic to tomatoes and he also got addicted to them. So if there's any one thing that you do in abundance, you can't get through the day without, eating 10 figs or, a large packet of cashew nuts, then there may be an issue with that.
Yeah, mine is dark chocolate. I think I still need to come to terms with that.
Mine used to be dark chocolate until I realized it was interfering with my sleep.
Ah,
And it contains theobromines, which are long lasting and very often interfere with sleep. The same is true with caffeine. I used to be a real caffeine addict, loved it. But caffeine, 8-hour half-life in the body, very persistent, bioaccumulate. And again, people will find they will sleep better. You cut out the caffeine. Now, it's not no caffeine ever. A little spot in the morning as the occasional treat is going to be absolutely fine. Ditto dark chocolate, but these problems can build up.
They can indeed. And I'm curious, with the PK diet, which is something that you're a huge advocate for, is there ever a time when it's not appropriate for someone?
Well, I really don't think so. I mean, I think that's going to be so rare. And the reason for that is that humans evolved over thousands of years, millions of years, eating a paleo-ketogenic diet. Now, it doesn't mean that no sugar ever. Guess what? Primitive woman would have had fruit and sugars in the autumn, because we have a windfall. And in fact, when we get a windfall of apples and pears and nuts and seeds and so on, that switches on the carbohydrate craving gene. So we eat those foods to excess. And we're meant to do that in the autumn because we get fat. And guess what? Getting fat is survival value for the winter. So primitive woman stopped eating those foods because she had no choice. She had to. But of course, now with modern agriculture and supermarkets, we can get those foods all year round, and we eat them because we're addicted, and we eat them because we can. So there's never an opportunity where that carbohydrate craving gene is switched off unless you do it yourself. You just say no. So It's not that sugars and carbohydrates are not essential. They are essential for the body. They are essential for making the raw materials of DNA, RNA, for making ATP. We use sugars to detoxify, for example. But they are addictive, and we are now just overwhelmed with them. And the vast majority of people having far too much of.
And one of the things that you mentioned as well in the book is doing a short-term carnivore diet for some people. And so when would that be appropriate? When would you maybe encourage somebody to do that?
Particularly if they're very allergic. Because in the old days, when in the early 1980s, when I started off down this path, the typical allergy diet was lamb, pears, and rice, which, it's a restricted food, but the pears and the rice would cause a terrible problem because they're both high in sugars and carbohydrates. So now a carnivore diet is a much safer starting point because a carnivore diet is completely healthy. There are, some primitive tribes who have just been eating carnivore for, hundreds of thousands of years and are completely healthy. So one can be completely healthy eating a carnivore diet of meat, fish, and maybe eggs. So for someone who's allergic, that's often a very good start. And allergies can often present with fatigue. Why? Because if the immune system is busy, as I say, that kicks a hole in the energy bucket. And the immune system demands an awful lot of energy. When the immune system is busy, there's a huge amount of energy pouring into that. We all know that. What happens when somebody gets flu? They run a fever, the immune system's busy, and they are bedbound, maybe, for weeks. So it illustrates the point. The immune system demands a lot of energy. And if it's busy for all the wrong reasons, allergy and autoimmunity, then as I say, that alone will make you fatigued.
Absolutely. And how do you find that your clients respond to being asked to go carnivore? Because I know that it can be a big ask for some people, but do you find that they're willing to embrace it?
It depends how ill they are. You see, the main reason people won't do just a paleo-ketogenic diet is because they're not ill enough. But people who come to see me, generally by the time they find me, they're sick people. They know they're ill. They know they haven't got the energy. They've got pain. Their sleep is disturbed. And quite honestly, they will do anything to get well. If I said, do 10 headstands a day, in the middle of the field at midnight, while the vestigial virgins dance around you, and could guarantee recovery, they would do it. And so, it sounds a bit bizarre, a carnivore diet, but if that's going to be a step towards recovery, then people will do it. And my experience with people with fatigue syndrome is they are highly motivated. Often these are people who have been at the top of their league in industry or athletics or sport or whatever, and they are really fed up because they haven't got the energy to function. And so, usually a carnivore diet, well, it sometimes appalls, but rarely so. They can see the logic, the reason behind doing it, then they will do it. Again, that's another really important reason why people have to understand why they are ill, what the mechanisms are, because without that, they don't have the intellectual imperative, they don't have the determination to say, right, I'm going to do this diet and I'm going to do it properly. And they need that determination because, as you know, when you start to give people regimes for recovery, you can get what's called a healing crisis. They can get worse initially. So they really have to understand why they're walking that path, why they're following that roadmap, why they're doing this diet, to give them the imperative to stick with it when things don't go smoothly.
Yeah, and I appreciate we're probably jumping around a little bit, but you mentioned that it's really important to understand the mechanisms. Maybe we could have a bit of a conversation about this idea of clinical picture versus diagnosis, because I think some people just want to get a diagnosis as if the diagnosis is going to be then the cure, which we know is definitely not the case. I guess you've already said it's really important to understand these mechanisms so that people can then start to understand what they need to do to be well. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that. It's almost like the politics of diagnosis.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Well, people don't come to their doctors with the diagnosis. It's up to the doctor to diagnose, but they do come with nasty symptoms. Severe fatigue, poor stamina, foggy brain, can't think clearly. In fact, many think they're going demented. And what they want is social acceptance. And so if they can say to their friends, I have been diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, that makes them feel a lot better about it. But it doesn't get them well because it doesn't address the mechanisms. And it gives them street credibility, let's say. But that's not sufficient for the likes of me. Okay, I want to know why they've got those symptoms, and hence a true diagnosis gives us obvious implications for management. To say it's all about the diet, micronutrient supplements, correcting mitochondrial function, correcting adrenal function, correcting thyroid. So they might come away from me with a shopping list of diagnoses. The thyroid's underactive. Oh, you're deficient in magnesium. Oh, or whatever. And we have to do it all. Now, another point I'd like to make here is that most people who come to me with fatigue syndromes are what I call PBs. And to explain that, I'm going to have to tell you a joke. Now, this derives from a newspaper article I read some decades ago about a merchant bank who wished to target their 100 wealthiest clients with a new investment scheme. So a letter got sent down to a printing department, but the scroff in the printing department forgot to press the mail merge button, which, normally you press in order to give everybody, a personalized letter. So it looks if that letter's coming from the director of the bank. But instead of pressing the mail merge button, a letter was received by their hundreds of wealthiest clients, which started out, "Dear rich bastard." So that's been subsumed into my language. So patients who've got lots of money are called RBs, they're rich bastard, and patients who haven't got any money are all PBs, they're poor bastards. And guess what? Most people with chronic fatigue syndrome are PBs. They don't have the energy to work. And that means, I can't spend loads of their precious money on expensive tests. I want them to spend that precious money on getting well in the shortest, most frictionless route. And that means reading the book, understanding that I've done it wrong for over 4 decades. I've been in the business of medicine for 43 years now. And I've found, the route to recovery. So take a leap of faith and just do the route and spend your money on the best quality food that you can possibly find, ideally organic, but I know that's expensive, and the nutritional supplements that we need to get you on the path of health. And there's no reason why it can't be. The first step couldn't be taken today, and there's no reason why you shouldn't make a full recovery.
Yeah, reading through your book, it is such a collection of just pretty much everything you need to know. Of course, there's areas in the book where you say, read more about this here, read more about this there. But I wish when I had been unwell that I had this book, at hand instead of stumbling through the dark to find it all on my own.
Well, that's very nice of you to say that. And in fact, that 3rd edition is actually the shortest one I've written. Because in the early editions, I just put in everything I knew. And then I realized that was just too overwhelming for most. And so that book is written on the need to know basis. And you do things in this order. You start at chapter 1, you do the diet and the supplements and sort out the fermenting gut, and then you work through the mitochondria. So it's written logically and easily. So I hope for most it will be all they will need to effect full recovery.
Because I had your book, I think the 2014 version, And I noticed that you also seem to have made some changes from what you were recommended. And obviously, it's been 10 years, hasn't it? So you have the basics package, which you call, I think, the tools of the trade in the book, which is that sort of basic set of supplements which are affordable, accessible. And I noticed that there are quite a few differences between what you're recommending there versus what you're recommending back in 2014. So I pick your brain on that?
I'm old and I'm a woman. I'm allowed to change my mind.
Of course,
and of course, we've never not been on a steep learning curve. So, if in that process I find, something that's shorter or quicker or cheaper or more efficacious, then yes, of course, I'm going to slot that in. But the overall route map is the same.
I had one question, which was about iodine, because you recommend iodine as one of the sort of tools of the trade. And I was curious on your thoughts on iodine and thyroid autoimmunity.
Well, first of all, there's no evidence that iodine causes autoimmunity. That is a myth. Now, what you have to remember is that, you and I and most of the rest of the world are up against Big Pharma. And Big Pharma's mantra is a patient cured is a customer lost. So the last thing Big Pharma want are cures. So when anything goes out there, any cheap, simple intervention like vitamin D, like iodine, like vitamin C, all these things, they do their very best to besmirch the reputation of in order to put people off using these interventions. And iodine is an absolute classic. It is so essential for normal human development, and we are all deficient. Very few people have iodine sufficiency. I mean, iodine deficiency, for example, is the number one cause of mental disease and low IQ throughout the world. And for that reason alone, we should be taking it. And iodine is essential for the brain, for the immune system, for bones, for fat burning, yes, for growing thyroid hormones, but for also other hormones. It's essential for our immune system. And without iodine, none of these things can work. And we know that the immune system is down in fatigue syndromes, ditto the brain. Iodine is just so important. And it's dirt cheap. I mean, a little pot of Lugol's iodine like that costs about £6, and that will last you for months. So say the last thing Big Pharma wants are cheap, effective, multitasking tools like those that we're describing in the book.
And that's kind of a nice segue into some of the other things that you talk about, like the DMSO, the methylene blue, the MIT. I was wondering, as a nutritional therapist, those things are beyond my scope of practice, but I know the listeners may want to know a little bit more about those. And of course, you talk about it in more detail in the book, but would you be prepared to touch on those?
Yes, of course. I mean, almost, but you say as beyond your scope of interest, but all these things, well, bar microimmunotherapy perhaps, but all these things, methylene blue, DMSO, anybody can access. You see, I have to give people the tools, and the tools that I've chosen, the tools that do not need a doctor's prescription. Because the awful thing about this wretched illness is there's only one person that's going to get you well, and that's you. And so often I find doctors are obstructive because they don't understand nutritional medicine. Certainly you'll hear very little from your doctor about diet. Very few inquire about sleep. Even fewer know what mitochondria are, let alone how to fix them and what to do. So all the tools of the trade pretty much in the book are things that anybody can access, whether it's thyroid glandulars, adrenal glandulars, nutritional supplements. Methylene blue is a fantastic antimicrobial, very broad spectrum, cheap as chips. Anybody can get hold of it. There's no reason at all, Anna, why you shouldn't and couldn't include these in your workup of patients.
That's really helpful to know. And I think you mentioned the MIT, the microimmunotherapy, is probably one of the exceptions. And I've had some people ask me a little bit more about that in my community. And I wonder if you could just speak to that a little bit more and how you find it useful with your patients.
Okay, well, essentially, microimmunotherapy is to the immune system what psychotherapy is to the brain. It's a reprogramming of the immune system so that it directs its fire appropriately against whatever you want to direct its fire against. And I find it helpful in autoimmunity, in allergy, and in chronic infection. So that's on the ME side of things. It can also be helpful for improving energy delivery mechanisms. There are remedies for mitochondria. But I wouldn't put those in place until all else had been tried. because so often when the immune system, it's in an inflamed state, that inflammatory fire is not directed. It's what I call a useless inflammation. It's driven by allergy to foods, maybe allergy to microbes in the upper fermenting gut or whatever, but it's just a destructive inflammation. And microimmunotherapy, it's often helpful to damp that down and to reprogram that so you get appropriate inflammation in the body, not inappropriate.
Yeah, and I think in your book, you have a list of if your immune system is overactive or running on the low side, and if you have these symptoms or those symptoms, you give recommendations about exactly what people might need.
And I work in partnership with many other therapists like yourself, Anna. I've set up a website called Natural Health Worldwide, where you can find a therapist. And the deal is any therapist that's on there, and it costs nothing to join, is welcome to pick my brains and ask me. And if they want me to supply them microimmunotherapy, then of course I can.
It's also very, very helpful to know. And while we're kind of more on the medication side of things, I noticed you're very pro melatonin. And again, it can be a controversial supplement in the industry. And I was wondering if you could discuss the benefits versus the risks.
Well, without a good night's sleep, nobody is going to get well from chronic fatigue syndrome or ME. Sleep is absolutely vital. And without melatonin, we cannot sleep. So it's a very useful supplement. You can get it very inexpensively from Piping Rock in America, and it's a very, useful. Now, the point is, what normally stimulates melatonin production is light, is full spectrum light. Now, I'm very privileged. I work in my conservatory, so I've got light, all around me. But most people don't. They work in dark rooms or with unnatural light. And as light falls, what we should do is get a great hit of melatonin. Now, that only happens when you get lots of bright light during the day, and most people don't. So to help boost their own melatonin levels, we can take it as a supplement very inexpensively. Now, people worry, they'll say, oh, if you take melatonin, won't you switch off your own production of melatonin, which applies to many other hormones like thyroid hormones, adrenal hormones, and so on, as we know. But the answer to that is no, it's not a problem, because it's not melatonin that switches off the production of melatonin, it's light. And melatonin is a very good antioxidant. As we age, our ability to produce it declines. It's protective against cancer. It does all sorts of other good things as well. So melatonin, which we can purchase very cheaply, is very useful. And the potential for harm is near zero. You occasionally get somebody who gets depressed with melatonin, so I have to warn them about that. I'm ashamed to say I'm not quite sure what the mechanism of that is, but it is a fact that can happen. So with all these interventions, we start low, go slow, ask the question, is it helping? Is it making us worse? And feel our way through the program in that way. But yeah, melatonin, very helpful.
Great. Thank you for clarifying. And the sense I get from reading the book is you're very passionate about what you call the upper fermenting gut.
Yes.
We must sort out the upper fermenting gut. So I was curious, obviously in the industry, we hear a lot about small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO, and is your opinion that those two things are the same, or are you talking about something different when you talk about upper fermenting gut?
It's the same thing. But upper fermenting gut is deliberately vague because small bowel bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, suggests it's in fermentation by bacteria, but it could equally as well be fermentation by yeast and fungi. So that's why I call it upper fermenting gut. Now, just to explain what it is, we have to explain how the normal gut should function. The total length of the human gut's about 30 foot, roughly. The first 20, 25 odd foot of gut is the upper, what we call the upper gut, from the mouth, esophagus, stomach, duodenum, jejunum, small intestine. That should be near sterile or as free from microbes as is possible. It's only the last sort of 5 foot of gut, the large bowel, where the microbiome resides. And yes, there are kilograms of bacteria there. And yes, they do much good for us. But that's where the microbes should be. Now, if we have a high sugar, high carbohydrate diet, we overwhelm the ability of the upper gut to become sterile. And as soon as you've got a free lunch there, as I call it, the microbes move in. So if I sat down and ate a kilogram or a pound of grapes, for example, and guess what? I'm an addict. I'd be very capable of doing that. I'm crunching up grapes in my mouth. I'm swallowing sugar. And of course, every grape is covered with yeast. And within maybe 10 or 15 minutes, a few minutes, that yeast will start to ferment and I will burp and belch and bloat. Those are all the cardinal symptoms of upper fermenting gut. But if we're doing that all the time, we're eating cereals at breakfast, biscuits midday, sandwiches at lunchtime, cake in the afternoon, if we're constantly overloading our upper gut with carbohydrates, those microbes stay and ferment constantly. And they ferment to produce nasty, toxic products. So if yeast ferments sugar, we produce alcohol. But other microbes will produce, and that's ethyl alcohol, other microbes will produce propyl alcohol, butyl alcohol, or maybe ammonacal compounds, D-lactate, hydrogen sulfide, a whole range of toxic compounds and gases, and these are all poisonous. And then the microbes themselves produce toxins. So bacteria produce bacterial endotoxin, fungi produce fungal mycotoxins, and all this toxic load has to be sorted out in the liver. Now, the liver is the most incredible organ of all, and the business of detoxification uses a huge amount of energy. So at rest, although the brain weighs 2% of body weight, it'll consume maybe 20% of all the energy generated in the body. The heart at rest uses about 7% of all the energy generated in the body. When the liver's working hard, it will consume 27% of all the energy generated in the body. That is huge. And as soon as people get rid of their fermenting gut and reduce the work of the liver, they immediately have more energy. So often they say, oh, my foggy brain's gone. I just feel so much sharper and better. Energy, that's working well. And the other problem with the upper fermenting gut are the microbes themselves. Now, we're taught at medical school that, yes, there are microbes in the gut and there they stay. Not true. We now know those microbes get quite easily from the upper gut into the bloodstream, and they can get dumped at distal sites. So in the muscles, the microbes get dumped there and you get an inflammatory reaction, and that's called fibromyalgia. If this happens in the joints, we call it arthritis, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis. These are all driven by allergy to microbes from the upper fermenting gut. Ditto intrinsic asthma. Psychosis can be explained by this. Urticaria, chronic eczema, intrinsic asthma, inflammatory bowel disease, kidney disease, all this can be explained by allergy to microbes from the upper fermenting gut. But it is a concept that is almost ignored in general medicine. But it's an important concept because what it means is that the treatment of all these conditions starts with sorting out the upper fermenting gut. And because, as you've read, we treat that firstly by starving them out, stop feeding those microbes with sugars and carbs. Okay, the occasional bit is fine, but not on a regular basis. And then we kill them with vitamin C, because vitamin C contact kills all microbes. And then we kill them with iodine, because iodine contact kills all microbes. Then we can get rid of the upper fermenting gut fairly quickly and easily. And with that, so much pathology just melts away. Energy is improved. All those conditions we ran through have the potential to be improved as well. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. But we're not talking years. We're talking days and weeks for this change to take place.
You make it sound so achievable, the way that you explain it.
And this is the one thing I really want people to get hold of, because they're faced with this apparently unsurmountable hill that they have to do. And they're told by doctors, oh, there's nothing you can do. You go and rest and hopefully time will take its course and reduce it and all this sort of tosh. And they're not told how to walk the walk. And that's what people want to know. They want to know how we can get better. We don't want to be told, oh, well, you might get better in 10 years or, oh, you've had it for so many years, there's no chance of you getting better now. That's a terribly negative message. No. And guess what? We know this. We know all this stuff works. Okay. It means changing the habits of a lifetime. It means doing new things. It means taking risks. It means going against, what your family might think and the mainstream narrative. But if the price at the end of the day is your health, then guess what? You're going to pay it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this feels like a nice place to move into the boring concept of pacing. That's just another thing I think that people really struggle to do. I think you say repeatedly in the book, it's boring, but you have to do it. So can you reinforce to the listeners how important that is?
Okay, now the reason it's important is because if we push ourselves beyond our capability, then we go into anaerobic metabolism. That's metabolism without oxygen. It's fermentation of sugar it's fermentation of fuel instead of proper burning fuel. And in the short term, it gives you a little bit of extra energy. But a side effect of that is you produce lactic acid, and lactic acid is very painful. It's what causes the angina, it causes the chest pain that we see in these patients. It's what causes the muscle pain. It's what drives the foggy brain. And the trouble with lactic acid is it's easy to go into anaerobic metabolism and produce it, but it's much harder to get lactic acid back to pyruvate where it should be. And lactic acid inhibits mitochondria, and mitochondria are the engines of our car. That's what allows us to burn fuel properly and aerobically. And because it takes so long to get rid of lactic acid, we end up with people on what I call a boom and bust cycle. So when they're booming, okay, they're doing it on adrenaline and, okay, yes, and aerobic metabolism, but also anaerobic. They produce lactic acid, and it takes a long time to get rid of that. And they bust. So we get much more product out of ourselves if we pace. So every day is about the same. The key here is if you get delayed fatigue, then that's pathological. So the difference between me and somebody who has a fatigue syndrome is, I will have a busy day today, and I work all day, and then, I've got the garden to do and the dog to walk and and in the evening I will be tired and I'll have a good night's sleep, and tomorrow I should be as right as rain. But if somebody is pushing themselves to try to do more than they're capable of, they will pay for it the next day. And that's pathological fatigue. And it's largely mediated by lactic acid. So yes, pacing is really boring. And using another analogy I use that people enjoy is that I see energy is like money. Money is jolly hard work to earn it, and it's great fun spending it. We can spend it on holidays, going out, getting somebody else to do the cooking for us and having a jolly time. And it's the same as true with energy. It's jolly hard work to earn it, and we have to earn it through diet, supplements, being disciplined about pacing, disciplined about sleep, and so on. But once we've got it, we can spend it, and we can spend it having a jolly time and having a giggle, and that's what life is all about.
Yeah, and it makes it worth it in the end, for sure. And the next question, I kind of guess it piggybacks off the end of the pacing conversation, is about exercise. In chapter 9 of the book, I think you have a chapter on finding the right types of exercise, and you have the sort of 6 stages of recovery and how people should generally progress to doing more. I'm curious in practice if you found that some people tolerate certain types of exercise better than others, or if it's universal for everyone.
Well, it's pretty much universal for everyone. And there are 2 types of exercise. There's exercises to make muscles stronger and bigger so that and those just should take a few minutes each day. And they should be slow. So things like press-ups, squats, they're very hard work, but say you only do them for 30 seconds or a minute, and that gets your muscles strong. And then there's aerobic exercise when we go out walking or in the garden or whatever. Now, those won't make your muscles stronger, but they're very good for morale, aren't they? Spending energy in doing things like, walking my little dog or going out in the garden, that's what gives me great pleasure. But don't think you're going to turn yourself into a marathon runner just by pottering around, doing a bit of walking, a bit of this, that, and the other. But that's what my fatigue syndrome have to do in the short term until they've got their energy reserves up. So the right sort of exercise is important. And, have some people who are so worried about losing muscle that they do far too much kind of weight training exercise, and they just wipe themselves out in the process. They just stop themselves from recovering fully. So it's getting that right balance of, retaining our muscles, but not in such a way that we delay and retard our recovery. But having strong muscles is important.
And that really helps to answer a question I had, because I saw in the book that you give a very, very small dose recommendation for the resistance-based training. And I was wondering if that was like a lifelong encouragement, or if people can build up more if they wanted to, provided it's within their capacity.
Absolutely. One of the features of aging is we lose muscle. And of course, you lose muscle, then, you become weaker, you're more prone to falling over, to more prone to accidents, and that kills people. Even if you've got somebody in their 80s, their 90s, they fall over and break a leg, that's a death sentence for many. So keeping strong and fit is also a vital part of aging. Now, We all know that this is this is not a battle. This is a war. We all know we have to fight this war for life. As we get older, we have to fight even harder. But guess what? It's worth it because it means we can maintain our function, so we can live life, I say, to its full potential in terms of quality and quantity. And that's what I want to do. Yes, of course, we know we're going to die, but I want to die, on my horse. I'm out riding, in the middle of nowhere, hopefully, when I'm having a lovely time, and that will be that. Hopefully in my 90s or my 100s, but we shall see.
I must just say, Sarah, like listening to you talk, you just ooze this sort of like positivity and inspiration, that this is possible for people. And I think it's a really important message for people to receive.
Of course it's possible. And guess what, primitive woman didn't just keel over the first time of a sniff or a cold. She had to get well. And so do we. And that's another really important thing. Again, this is a book that I often give my cancer patients, called Radical's Remission by Kelly Turner. And she went and interviewed people who'd been effectively given a death sentence. You've got 2 weeks to live. You've had all the radiotherapy, all the chemotherapy, everything we can throw at you. And, that's it. And all the people who she interviewed, they all recovered. And she was asking the question, what made the difference? And they all said, oh, I had a project. Well, first of all, they all made dramatic differences to their diet. But also, I want to walk my daughter down the aisle when she's 22 or whatever, when she gets married. I want to travel the world. I've got a book I want to write. I've got to finish that garden. They all had something in their life that really drove them on, that they wanted to do. Again, I don't know if you've read Viktor Frankl's book. He was prisoner
Man's Search for Meaning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he asked the question, what was the difference between people who survived, the concentration camps and who didn't? Only 1 in 28 who went in came out. I mean, the statistics are just appalling. But one of the factors was that those that survived said, I've got to get home. I've got a family who are dependent on me. I want to finish this opera. I want to write this book. I have stuff I want to get done. They were the ones that survived. And it's exactly the same with any illness you care to mention. So you've got to want to survive. You've got to be prepared to take difficult steps to make the difference. And there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't do that. But, doctors take away power from people. They say, oh, come to me and I'll get you well. And then they say, oh, actually, we haven't got anything for you. Well, that's no damn good at all, is it? And what I'm saying is with these books is I'm trying to say to everybody, we've all had the power to recovery. And in this book about fatigue syndrome, here is the roadmap. Here are the simple tools you have to do to put it all in place. And that's up to you to walk the walk. And there's no reason at all why, it can't be done.
I love that so much. I feel like I've got 100 questions still that I would like to ask you. I'm just going to pick a few of them because I am conscious of your time as well. I have a question about toxins. You list in the book toxins for people to avoid. I've got 2 questions about toxins, actually. The first was if there's any ones in particular that you really notice to be an issue for people, because it can be overwhelming to think I've got to now navigate eliminating all these toxins from my life. The second question was about silicone, but maybe I'll let you answer the first one first.
Right. Well, the first thing to remember is that the single biggest cause of toxins comes from the upper fermenting gut, because we're fermenting a whole load of toxins. And secondly, lactic acid by not pacing. So we've already reduced the toxic load substantially just by those 2 interventions. But the rest of the toxins can be split into 2 groups. And the majority of toxins are things that we can smell, that are in our food, that are cosmetics, that are around us. So yes, you want to do a good kind of cleanup of our environment. And they can all be got rid of by heating regimes or sweating regimes. Now, I'm mindful that, many of my fatigue syndrome patients certainly can't exercise. And so an Epsom salt bath is a very, very good way of detoxing. It's very cheap. Most people have got a bath. You can buy Epsom salts very inexpensively directly from epsomsalts.co.uk. And the usual recipe is 0.5 kilogram of Epsom salts per bath. It works out each bath costs about £1. So it's a very cheap way of detoxing. And that's a great way of getting rid of volatile organic compounds, pesticides, hair dyes, things that get stuck in our body. The only thing is that toxic metals will not be got rid of with those interventions. But hey-ho, guess what? Vitamin C helps us strip out toxic metals. Iodine helps us strip out toxic metals. That's what makes them 2 of my favorite multitasking tools. Okay, we can do a test to measure, but the point is all the things we're already talking about, maybe plus the heating regimes, are massively going to help us to detox. And we do all this stuff in parallel with improving nutritional status, helping mitochondria, and so on. So the detoxing, okay, it might sound overwhelming, but actually there's nothing too difficult about it. You just have to get on and do it. And you were also going to ask about silicone. Well,
yeah, I read in the book that you lecture on the problems of silicone regularly, and I have had people ask me about breast implant illness, and I was curious if you had any thoughts on that you wanted to share.
Well, it's a major driver of a whole heap of pathology, because silicone is not an inert substance. From the day that silicone breast implant or testicular implant or whatever's being used is put in, the silicone starts to diffuse out of the implant. Now, silicone is a plastic. And we all know, we cannot break down plastics. The world is full of plastics, and they're there forever until we find a good microbe that will break it down for us, maybe. But they are extremely persistent. Now, these plastics get into the bloodstream, and the immune system sees this, and got to get rid of that. So it tries to get rid of it. It tries to engulf it. It tries to destroy it with enzymes. But we know that's not possible. They can't. That doesn't happen. So that silicone does is it switches on inflammation wherever the bit of silicone happens to be. Now, if you've got a breast implant, obviously initially you get the silicone in the tissues immediately around the breast, and the body tries to wall that off with a layer of fibrous tissue. So you get this fibrous capsule around the silicone implant, which then contracts. And this is sometimes the reason why these silicone implants go hard. It's the fibrous tissue around them that contracts to try to extrude that implant, to try to get rid of it like you would a foreign body in the system. A recognized treatment for this is a surgeon just grabs hold of the breast and crushes it between his hands in order to rupture the implant. Now, of course, you end up with a soft boob, but then you've got a massive spill of silicone throughout the tissues there, which then gets directly into the lymphatics, into the bloodstream, and it can drive multiple sclerosis, it can drive arthritis, it can drive liver disease. It's real bad news. So, no, I do not like silicone implants. If I've got somebody with a fatigue syndrome, I encourage them to get rid of it and replace it with, all breast implants have got some silicone in them, so there isn't an easy replacement. So it's a difficult one. But the key is, don't have the wretched thing in the first place. It's an invitation for bad health and disaster.
Yeah, there we go. Kind of the final big question I have for you is just talking a little bit about the emotional holes and the energy in the energy buckets. And something I've picked up from just what clients are saying, what people are saying to me is there's a lot of messaging out there, which is like, it's almost like a bit dogmatic, like this is only a physiological disease or this is only a psychological disease. And you're quite clear about we need to work on both. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. I think you mentioned like we need to work with psychological practitioners who also appreciate the physiological condition. So could you speak to that a bit?
Absolutely. I mean, all chronic disease has a psychological component. I mean, I don't like to emphasize it, but otherwise the psychiatrists pick this up and say, the reason you're fatigued is because you're psychologically stressed and you're just chronically anxious, and that's. For some people, that's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. So yes, and I don't pretend to be very expert at treating what I call the emotional hole in the bucket. And that's why, yes, skilled psychotherapists and counselings can be extremely helpful to help people deal with that. But what I do know is that if I can give people the energy, then they then have the energy to deal with this. And one example of this is I often see victims or troops from the Gulf War or from the Afghanistan War who have post-traumatic stress. And believe you me, that is a very real and very nasty condition that leads to suicide and terrible sequelae. But they often have a fatigue syndrome as well. And once you can recognize that we can improve these people, with the diet, with the supplements, with the detox regimes, that then allows the psychotherapy to work well. Because so many of these veterans, they come back and one moment they're in Afghanistan with the horrors, and the next moment they've been flown home and they're in the shopping centre, with a so-called normal life around them, feeling completely bewildered. and they end up going to psychiatrists. And all psychiatrists do is they just replace one addiction with another. So by the time they get to see me, they're on antidepressants, which are addictive. They're on tranquilizers, which are addictive. They're on major tranquilizers, which are addictive. Some of them taking street drugs as well to try to help cure their stress. Because as we mentioned earlier, we use addiction to deal with stress. And that's what the psychiatrists often do. They just prescribe more addictions. So if we can get them off all their addictions, their alcohol, their street drugs, their prescribed drugs, then all of a sudden you find there's a human body in there and a brain in there that can then, with guidance from therapists, can then process those terrible post-traumatic experiences that they are suffering from, and that can help massively.
It's really, really insightful. Thank you. So, have you got any final words of wisdom that you want to share? Anything I haven't asked yet that just feels important to say?
Oh, bless you. Oh, gosh. Well, I suppose the most important thing is just keep it simple. This is a keep it simple, sweetheart, was an American saying during the Second World War when they were repairing broken down trucks and things. Keep it simple and just do it. There's nothing difficult about this. Please don't be overwhelmed by it. As the Chinese say, the longest journey starts the first step. So if you can understand where you're going and why, you will then have the intellectual imperatives to, as I say in all my moves, just do it. Just get on, make the change and stuff. It won't happen overnight, but just make the changes and feel the improvements, feel the changes, and go on from there. And just keep walking and knowing that you can cure this wretched illness.
And where can people get your book? I don't know if it's out yet for public purchase, or do you want to just say a little bit more about that?
You can get it at sales at Dr. Myhill. You can get it from Hammersmith Books as well. So it's not yet an international bestseller, I'm sad to say, but it is
Which is a shame.
Well, of course, I think it should be, because as I keep saying, this is the blueprint for the starting point to treat everything. So if somebody came to me with dementia, I would treat them in exactly the same way. The diet, the fermenting gut, the mitochondria, the thyroid stuff, ditto heart disease, ditto cancer, all this, the basic starting blocks, the basic package to treat all these things is there in the book. So it's a very good all-rounder.
Yeah, and I just want to say I read it in preparation for our interview, and I just think it's such a great handbook that if anyone is going through this sort of illness experience, they need to get a copy.
Very kind. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for your time, Sarah. And it's been such a pleasure. And, you and your energy and your presentation and your passion really is a testament to the fact that these regimes do work. So I think you've been practicing medicine before I was even born. So thank you for all your service to the community and for everything that you've done for so many people.
My pleasure.